Welcome back, everybody. This is another Conversations on Anarres. My name is Joseph Orosco. I'm a professor of philosophy at Oregon State University, and I'm the co-director of the Anarres Project for Alternative Futures. The Anarres Project is a forum for conversations, projects, and initiatives that try to imagine a future free of domination, exploitation, oppression, war, and empire. And one of the projects that we maintain is this Conversations on with Anarres, where we try to talk with various scholars, activists, and artists about what it takes to have a radical imagination, a radical transfiguration in thinking about the future. And so my guest today is a scholar who is thinking about philosophy and how we might reconceptualize the notion of doing philosophical thought, particularly philosophy of the Americas. My guest today is Dr. Kim Diaz. So Dr. Diaz, welcome. Thank you very much for being here with us today.
Thank you, Jose, for inviting me.
So let me just give a bit of background for folks about who you are. Kim Diaz earned a PhD in philosophy from Texas A&M University in 2012, and her research is grounded in the experience of Latinx and Latin American philosophy, specifically social political issues that characterize the Latin American experience. She teaches at philosophy programs and Chicano studies programs throughout Texas and the U.S.-Mexico border. She is an editor of the journal InterAmerican Philosophies, and she has published in a variety of different philosophical journals, including Philosophy in the Contemporary World, Societies Without Borders, the American Philosophical Association newsletter on Hispanic, Latino issues in philosophy, and most recently, and part of the reason that I wanted to talk with you, Dr. Diaz, is that you are the co-editor, along with Matt Faust, of a new collection called the Philosophies of the Americas Reader, that's put out by Bloomsbury, the UK publisher. And I wanted to talk with you a little bit about this idea of doing inter-American philosophies and the way that it's been embodied in the work that you do in this collection. So, I wanted to touch base with you. Your career up to now has been defined in terms of doing this area of philosophy called inter-American philosophy. And like I said, you're the editor at this journal that's out of Texas A&M University, the Inter-American Journal of Philosophy. So I was wondering if you might explain a little bit about what inter-American philosophy involves. What is this way of doing philosophy, and who are the important figures in this field? What does this field seek to accomplish within philosophy?
Thank you, Jose, for that great introduction. Yeah. So, it's interesting because I remember some years ago, a friend of mine, because I have friends, Tom Ellis, invited me to do a guest lecture on pragmatism. And I was like, how do you describe pragmatism, right? I'm swimming in it. It's what I love to, it's one of my areas that I love. But then where do you start, Yeah, so back, because you and I have known each other now for some years, when I was a graduate student, I just wanted to do more Latin American philosophy. Latin American, this is also before Latinx. So we just wanted to put Latin American philosophy on the map. And then it became a thing. It's now a recognized field. And then with Gregory, you mentioned that I'm the editor. I'm the managing editor. Gregory, we all know Gregory Papas is the chief editor, and it was great. I remember thinking of, how are we going to call the journal even? There was a point there that we wanted to call it something like transactions between, going off on Peirce and James transacting between the Americas. And then Gregory had the book on pragmatism in Latin America, right? And so we thought, okay, well, Inter-American, it was really Gregory's idea, Inter-American Journal of Philosophy. And so what we did was just expand what America means, right? So I'm from El Paso and Juarez, from the El Paso Juarez border. And every time, and so part of the reason for the book goes back a long way, because every time you cross the bridge, they ask you, the customs officers, you might remember the customs officers ask you, American, are you American? And then there's a part of me that is like, well, yeah, I'm American, you know, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if I'm from Colombia or Ecuador, right? Or Chile. All of us are American. And so, yes, so with Gregory, it was expanding America. It was inter-American. It was just including both the Latin and the American. And you know, he just came up with this, or he's about one of his articles is coming up, the one on contrapunteo, right? Where he talks about maybe like the right balance between. I met you at the SAP, at the Society for the Advancement of American Philosophy, and I have to give a lot of credit to Gregory, because Gregory is the one that slowly but surely started opening up the space for Latin American to be included as American. And then, you and I have been there, at the SAP, and, making space and creating that space. And so it's kind of like an outgrowth of I feel, supportiveness of the Society for the Advancement of American Philosophy, because I feel like they've always been supportive. So, for us to present papers on Ansaldúa or on Cesar Chavez, right, panels, and so then, and then the Inter-American Journal, and the book for me. About 5 years ago, I was asked to teach a class on American philosophy. And so I took a look at the course description, and it only had the usual suspects, right? Dewey and James and Peirce, Adams. And I thought, you know what, this is my chance to broaden what American means, because U.S. Americans, a lot of U.S. Americans, when we say America, we mean the U.S. exclusively, right? But it's the continent, not just the country. And so that's where I started playing with the ideas. Well, what if I include Cesar Chavez? What if I include Mariátegui? And so that's what I did for the syllabus. And then that syllabus ended up, Matt and I met at the APA in Vancouver. We were having pancakes and for breakfast, and I shared what was going on in my life at the time. So then after our meeting, he went and met with a book editor, and that's how we got the contract.
Nice.
It happened very organically.
So, I mean, part of this idea then, from what you're saying then, is that Inter-American philosophy is really this kind of attempt to think broadly about the meaning of philosophy that's done in the continent of America, North, South, Central America, because for so long, right, the idea of American philosophy, that term has been specifically about a genre of specific, early classical American philosophy, like this trio of white men right? Josiah Royce, William James, John Dewey, maybe Peirce, Charles Sanders Peirce, right? And then, broadening to include women like Jane Addams. And then, in the next movement of opening it up was to include folks from the Africana tradition, most notably, yeah, Alain Locke and W.E.B. Du Bois and so forth. And that's just been slowly expanding. So in the last, say, maybe 20 years or so, there's been the effort to include Latin American philosophy or Latinx thought in all of that. But it seems that what this is doing in some sense, right? In the idea of inter-American philosophy is really saying that there's something special about the idea of trying to get in dialogue folks from the Latin American experience with that pragmatist transcendental tradition, that there's something important. I mean, that's the work that Gregory Papas has been advocating a lot through SAP for a lot of years. And so your work is in some sense trying to provide resources for that kind of conversation in some way.
Yeah, it's all American, it's all American. It's not just, American Indian or Asian American, it's still all American. Not only not just Dewey and not just James, as much as I like them, they're not the only American ones.
Yeah, well, and what's interesting too, as I hear you speak, I think back. I'm not sure if you know this one essay by Elizabeth Betita Martinez, the Chicana activist philosopher. She has this essay that I think she wrote in about 2000, 2001 called "Don't Call This America," and she gives the sort of the argument that you've been talking about here. But she says that one of the things she says is that we need to stop calling, people, residents of the United States, Americans. And, she suggests U.S. Americans, because in Spanish, right, in Castellano, at least, right, in certain parts of Latin America, sometimes U.S. folk are referred to as estadounidenses. So there's a word at least. But in the United States, there's no, United Statesian doesn't really work very well. So Betita Martinez suggests we start talking about U.S. Americans, right, to distinguish them from the rest of the Americans in all of the continent. To sort of realize that figures throughout Latin America often talked and referred to themselves as Americans, Americanos as well, and so that there's a weird kind of arrogance in the United States to appropriate that term. And she thinks it's a kind of political intervention to use U.S. Americans because it's a recognition of the specific kind of place of the United States, and it refuses the kind of imperial reach of the idea of American that United Statesians have done by sort of encompassing that term to mean only them. So it seems as though, there's a kind of a philosophical conceptual project here, but there's also sort of a political intervention, right? Is that you think that there's an important kind of thing to come out of doing this work of trying to show that there's rather than American philosophy, there ought to be philosophies of America in some way.
Right, including, Hawaiians, right? Or basically, because it ties up with race, And so American, when people say a lot of, typically, like they don't include Hawaiians, which is, a territory of the US since it was seized, right? But because of the skin color, because of the culture, they're not real Americans. And so we go back with like, okay, well, what does it mean to be a real American?
Yeah. No, that's important. So let's talk a little bit about this reader that you put together out of your experience of preparing for this class. This has just been issued this year, the Philosophies of America Reader from Bloomsbury Press. So you've talked a little bit about the origins of the book. Can you talk about how it's structured and what kind of form it takes? What does it look like? What is this, the Philosophies of the America Reader look like? Why is it different than other kinds of American philosophy collections?
Yeah, we tried to be as inclusive as we were able to. It has not quite 5 chapters. Bloomsbury calls them parts, but for us, they're basically chapters. And so then the chapters are, the first one is on metaphysics, which is identity and self. The second one is on epistemology, knowing. We called it knowing and learning, I think. And the third one is on spirituality and aesthetics. The fourth one is on ethics, and then the last one is social political. And within each chapter, there's about 10, give or take 10 readings. And so then we try to say, okay, well, metaphysics. We open with Our America from Jose Marti. And we try to go chronologically. I think that's the only one that's out of order, or there might be a couple more. But so yeah, we start with Our America, right? So like, how do you define the identity of an American? And he does, right? And then Emerson and self-reliance, and we have like different readings, Mead, the I and the Me. And we have also Cordova, B.F. Cordova, the American Indian philosopher, on American Indian ontology, and right, like, so the identity and the metaphysics. And then we have, like, I think it's Okihiro. He does is yellow, black, or brown? So different ways of approaching identity from different traditions within the Americas. I'm trying to remember. I don't remember exactly, in order all the people that we have, but that's the idea, right? So then the same thing for the chapter on epistemology and learning. We have the questions, the typical questions on epistemology, but then from the tradition of all these different traditions.
So the idea is like to take, kind of traditional political categories, right? But to see how different groups in the Americas, right, as the continent, have sort of spoken to those themes in various ways, right? And maybe the different ways in which those communities have thought about those to show. So you're not sort of posing this as an alternative to like traditional Anglo pragmatism or something or other, but situating something like classical pragmatism as one voice amongst many voices within this hemisphere, right? These two hemispheres, right? On different kinds of philosophical experiences.
Correct. I remember now the very first one. I think it's El Popol Vuh, the section on knowledge from El Popol Vuh, and where the gods fog our eyes, and so then our knowledge is limited. Like, I can't read your mind, and but so yeah, so their take on why our knowledge is limited.
That's excellent. Yeah.
Yeah.
What's your favorite section of this collection of those 5 parts? Which one do you speaks to you the most, and why is that?
I of course, it's like I have several, right? It's I have several, but there's 2. If I had to narrow it down, there's 2 I really like. Sor Juana's letter to Sor Filotea, and I like Black Elk, the Great Vision. Those are my 2 favorites. The one from Sor Juana, I like it because I just, for men and women, for both of us, it's not just women, but it's a woman who wrote it. She just wanted to read, and now she just wanted to read and to write. During her time, even during our time, it's not easy for a woman to. I want to be a writer. I want to be a writer, and the cultural, social expectations are. But I have to say, it's for men too. Well, qué chulo, mijo, right? How are you going to support your family, right? What kind of money? And so then, but basically, she just wanted to read and write philosophy. And so this is something that you as a philosopher, me as a philosopher, we've had to contend with, with the cultural expectations, the gender expectations of you just don't do that. And so that was what she wanted to do. So I like her. And then I like the Great Vision. I think the Great Vision is the the reading that is just above all others from there, because all the other ones have to deal mostly with like the human issues, but that one is cosmic. It's at a cosmic level of he reaches an understanding of his place in the universe that the other pieces don't get there. So he's great, and it's great that the guy, I forget his name, the guy who wrote down his vision. I'm glad that he did, and now we have access to it.
So you mentioned this a little bit about talking about Sor Juana, right? In the 1600s in Spain, trying to write philosophy,
In Mexico, she was Mexicana.
right, and and all the pressures of the colonial Mexico at that time that were against her. But as you point out, this is still the case, right, for many people, particularly marginal students from marginalized communities, like many of the students perhaps that you teach in El Paso, right? Why do you think it's important for philosophy students and scholars today to think along the lines of to think about the philosophies of America rather than American philosophy? Like, why is it important to do this kind of work, other than sort of like, oh, isn't that cool, right? There's some other people that were doing philosophy. It seems like you're saying that there's something important about doing philosophy in this particular kind of way in general, but also, I was wondering if you might comment about like how whether or not you think that this is an important kind of avenue of doing philosophy for maybe the students that you deal with in El Paso, right? And the folks that you teach, because you teach at a variety of institutions, but I know that you also teach at El Paso Community College, which is largely Mexicano, Mexican American. How do they react to this idea of inter-American philosophy or philosophies of the Americas? But in general, like, why is this important to sort of think about?
Yeah, so it's interesting, I don't know. I can give you the perspective from here from the border, but at least my perspective from the border, because even from the border, there's different perspectives, right? But so I started reading philosophy early on, but then the once we start going to school, I think, and start like university, or we get the Western tradition, we get the Western canon. And so then it's the Greeks. It's the Greeks, right? And so then there's a part that if we don't question that canon, and if you are still in junior high or high school, it's you're dealing with growing up and just being a teenager, and so you're not really thinking about, wait a minute, the Western canon. But if you don't question it, then you grow up to think that European people are the ones that do philosophy, and not or European or American Anglo are the ones that do philosophy, or Germans, right, or French. And so then there is a sense of devaluing, or you don't think that American Indians do philosophy, right? It may be more like mythology, but not real philosophy. And so I think it's really important for people from different backgrounds to know that their people have been doing philosophy this whole time. It doesn't look like Anglo-analytic philosophy because it comes from a different place, but it's still philosophy, it's still touching on the big questions. So I think it's important for everybody to recognize that, yeah, philosophy is universal. It's not, it doesn't just come from one place. And I think that's important because it just opens up more possibilities for people if we can, if we can access that process of questioning and coming up with different possibilities. I personally think it's very liberating. Doing philosophy is liberating.
Well, it seems if I hear you right, let me know if this is what I'm hearing correctly. Right, is that on the one hand, it's important for certain students coming into philosophy from maybe non-traditional backgrounds, from marginalized communities, to be able to have a certain kind of sense of their backgrounds reaffirmed by saying, like to a Mexican American Mexicano student, right? There are folks in your history that were doing philosophy. It wasn't just German and French and Anglo-American people doing philosophy, but that philosophy is something that is in your background as well, and there's something to be explored there.
It just looks different.
Right, it looks different, but you're talking about the big questions in certain ways, but approaching it perhaps with different kinds of angles of vision, perhaps. I like that. I mean, I think that that's the kind of stuff that I know that like Jim Maffei and other folks have been sort of trying to look at, in sort of excavating Nahua and Aztec philosophy in that kind of way. Alejandro Santana, another friend of ours, right, is thinking about this kind of thing about like expanding the boundaries of what we call philosophy to include lots of different kinds of forms of questioning. And once we do that, then we realize that a lot of people have been doing philosophy, but it's not all the same sort of methodology.
Think about it, and I like this about Gregory because Gregory comes at it from music, right?
Yeah.
Drums are universal,
Yeah.
right? The sitar and then the guitar, right?
Yeah.
So it's just like when you look at instruments or a horn, right? If it was a conch or if it was a horn or if it was a brass trumpet, it's still a type of horn, right?
Mm-hmm.
So which one is the legitimate? Which one is the authentic one? Well, they're different items produced from different material, but it's still you can recognize it as a drum, you can recognize it as a horn, or you can recognize it as a stringed, as a type of stringed instrument. So it's, I think, in music, obviously you have like classical music, right? Classical European music, because
Mm-hmm.
classical Indian music is different than classical European. So yeah, it's just it's interesting with philosophy. In philosophy, it's this the Greeks and the Europeans have the monopoly, right? And then a lot of other cultures think it's we come to believe, right? We buy that it's not, but it's just a drum, right? And this is what Jose Marti says, right? Is yeah, okay, well, we might have plátanos, right? We might have plantains, but we don't have olive trees, but we have banana trees, and
Right.
you know.
Well, I mean, part of it too, it seems, the way you think about this too, sort of my second observation about this is that, as you were putting it, philosophy deals with these kinds of universal questions that confront like humanity as such in a way. I wonder what you think about this tack. I know that some folks have approached this kind of argument, like our colleague Robert Sanchez has talked about this in some ways, is that this kind of ways of doing philosophy, of approaching like something like the philosophies of the inter-American philosophy, this is really important because otherwise we're not being, I don't know how you'd call it. I mean, the technical jargony term would be epistemically responsible, right? Is that we're not getting an honest picture of the human experience if we are not thinking about including these different ways of doing philosophy in our work. And so, if you're interested in understanding the experience of human beings in the Americas, studying James and Dewey and Du Bois and all those folk, you know, that's an important set of voices, but it's not the only one if you're not also including other sort of, you know, Afro-Latinx, the Asian experience, the indigenous experience. These are all different kinds of experience of this place. And that not to include that, it means that you're getting a very sort of narrow slice of the human experience here. And so if you really want to understand the sort of universality of this experience, you need something like Inter-American philosophy to get that right. And if not, otherwise, then you are, as you were saying, like the experience of the Popol Vuh, you are blind really to the experience of what it means to be a human in this place at this time.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, that's very powerful.
And then, you know, and it creates all sorts of other problems, right? A feeling of superiority, the racism, the sexism, the heteronormativity, just yeah.
That's very powerful. Well, I mean, one of the things that you've been doing too is, I mean, what's impressive about your work is not only are you interested in talking about inter-American philosophy and the philosophies of the Americas, but you've also done a lot of work expanding this kind of dialogue to include Asian thought, particularly Indian philosophy. And you've sponsored conferences that engage dialogue between Latin American and US American and Indian philosophers together. Could you talk about these kinds of connections and why you think it's important to do that broader kind of work?
I feel like telling you a story about that. Why is it important? I want to tell you more about how I came into it. I fell into it more by accident, actually. So yeah, I was doing martial arts, and I wanted to. Once it was a little bit like Black Elk, you know, where he was like, well, he had an insight. He got really sick, and that's why the fever induced his vision quest, right? But I started doing martial arts, and so then and I started meditating. The stars aligned, and so then I found myself working in Huntsville, Texas. And Huntsville, Texas is where in Texas the capital punishment is carried out, and people who do life sentences go there, right? So I thought I'm gonna share. I don't know how long I'll be here, but while I'm here, I thought I'm gonna share this insight of freedom that one gets through martial arts, and it's an embodied. You know, it's like with Black Elk, is it's not something like a logic proof that you get in here. It's a qualitative change that happens in a person's experience. So I thought I'm going to share this because it would really benefit, I thought, you know, for me to share this with the people here and for them to have access to it. Well, you know, they don't, for obvious reasons, they don't let people who are incarcerated learn martial arts. So I thought, okay, well, I'm going to go the path of yoga. And so I started picking up yoga, really, so that I could, because they let yoga people go into the prisons and teach yoga. And it's just a different door into the same house. So I went to India to study yoga, and the more time I spent there, the more I realized how similar the cultures were. The cultural in terms of the Mexican and the Indian. You know, initially I would tell my colleague, his name is Ajay Verma. He's the one that hosted me at Jawaharlal Nehru University. I would tell him, look, we're both short and brown, and we like spicy food. Like, there's so much similar now. But then you dig deeper, and Indians were colonized by the British also, and so they have a very strong sense because they were colonized not as long as the Americas were, but so their sense of their classic philosophy is very, very strong. Stronger, I would say, than the American are in terms of their the Aztec and the Mayan. Um, it's more relevant. I mean, the caste system was done away with, but it's still, people still see themselves as Brahmin, descending from that tradition. So anyway, yeah. So we thought let's 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 see how Indians have dealt with colonization as opposed to Americans, the continent, right? And so you have the indigenous within both traditions, the classic philosophies like with the Indian classical Indian philosophy, and then yeah, the different ways of oppressing, even within the cultures, even without adding the European coming in to give our cultures, the European paradigm. So that's what we've been doing. Yeah, that's what we've been working on.
Do you see yourself continuing on in this work of sort of inter-American, Latin American philosophy and Indian connection?
Yeah, and that has to do, one of the things that I've done is along with Juan Ferret, we teach philosophy he started teaching philosophy to people in the system, returning citizens, but also people who are still incarcerated. And then I joined them 6 years ago, and I started sharing meditation with them. And so then it's a different way to access freedom, and so yeah, so we've been doing this and we've been very successful, and because there's different types of freedom besides being able to vote, right, or being able to go to school, or being able to own property or not be property. There's different types of freedom. And so yeah, the tradition that I'm going with in terms of the Asian philosophy goes hand in hand with, the Freire that I love from the Latin American philosophy, which is just how to expand our awareness so that we have a wider perspective. And from that wider perspective, we have more choices.
I think we're going to have another conversation in which we explore some of these insights that you've had from your experience of teaching meditation on the inside, right, with incarcerated folk, because it seems like there's a lot of sort of interesting kinds of ideas to sort of explore about, like, what that means, what that kind of location means for being able, like you said, to be able to start opening up, our assumptions about what certain ideas mean, like freedom. So we're going to have to talk about a little bit more about this at some point. Maybe that's your next collection, right? The philosophies of incarceration, right? Sort of expanding like what that kinds of means.
Right? It's still liberation philosophy, right? It's all in the same tradition, but me being able to have techniques to share with people instead of just, okay, let's read Oscar Romero, which is great, right? But the liberation philosophies of the Americas don't have techniques that you can just share with people, so that people become aware of the patterns that we have. The oppressive patterns that we have, all internalized.
Oh, interesting. So part of what you're seeing is that what the Indian tradition gives you are embodied ways of coming to awareness of the concepts that are spoken of theoretically in theories of liberation. This is something that's missing from the Latin American perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because we all get habituated to holding our bodies a certain way, right? And so with this other practices, you go from your body to creating more space. So if you think of yoga, we all move and sit in certain ways. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And with yoga is you're trying to slowly but surely with practice allow your body to, for instance, just develop a wider range of motion. Mm. And so, so you do the same thing with your mind so that you have a wider set of possibilities from which to choose instead of the same ones that we always use, which a lot of them are cultural. We, just it's the software that we inherit. Yeah, and then more possibilities means you get to choose instead of moving the same way because that's the way you've always moved or that's the way you've always sat. You get to pick if you want to sit a certain way because you can, because you've been working on your body to have the range of motion that will allow you to sit any way you want,
Yeah, no, I'm starting to see like this big pattern to your work and your life's career, right? You are dedicated in some sense to liberation philosophy, seems first and foremost. InterAmerican philosophy is this way of talking about expanding the range of voices that can give us more that kind of unpack our intellectual assumptions in our cultural traditions in the Americas about what it means to be human. You're expanding the range of all of that. And now, right, with your explorations of Indian thought, it's about sort of embodied intellect, right? And trying to just find ways of thinking about expanding the possibilities of the human experience for liberation from those kinds of ways of being that hem us into saying, this is only the one way, or this is the best way. So really, in a lot of this work, what you're thinking about, it seems, is that your work is really as a liberation philosopher. Well, I mean, thinking about, that's my take on you. What I'm seeing from your work. Where would you like your work to go in the future? What would you like to be doing? Are there projects that you have in mind that you would like to go on from now that you've sort of finished this reader? And I imagine you're going to be using it and teaching with it, as I hope to at some point. Where would you like to go next?
Yeah. So definitely continue to work with my students who are in the system because it's they're awesome. Their perspective really, they teach me so much more than I teach them. It's just the honest truth. So, and I just want to continue sharing what I love with them, but then helping to create more opportunities for them. So Juan and I'm just speaking of Juan, it's a whole team. We have a whole team of people who are very dedicated and committed to creating more opportunities for them so that, the recidivism rate is really high. So it's like about 80% within the first 5 years. So, and it's intergenerational, right? Because it's like, if the kids grow up, some of my students have had their kids are already in prison, so it's intergenerational and it affects primarily communities of color. So I would like to continue to work with them. I love working with them. They're cranky at the beginning. They're very cranky, but they're challenging and it's great to see them thrive. So I would love to continue to work with them. I'm working on a book on it's still very much in the works, but it's going to be a summary of Latin American philosophy. Um, and then another one that I would really like to do is it would give me an opportunity to go back to Brazil and hopefully live there to study. So I went to Jamaica a few years ago, and I went up to the Maroons, to a couple of the Maroon towns, Kumpang and Nani Falls. The two people it was a brother and a sister who led like an insurrection of back then they were enslaved and they just wouldn't have any of it, and so they just fled up into the mountains. And you've had these, like you had them in Mexico, the palenques, and then in Brazil you had the quilombos. And so yeah, for me it would be fun to go and visit and learn from them. So with the Maroons, they gained their independence before Jamaica was officially declared independent, right? Um, yeah, so to me it's like what it's interesting to me what clicks in here, that somebody sees themselves as a free person and not allow themselves to be dominated, and then some of us are dominated. We whether it's through sexism or classism, or we just think of ourselves, that's just how it is and this is how we behave, and some of us don't, some of us won't have any of it. So these groups of people wouldn't have any of it. So they left, and so it's interesting to me. That's interesting to me. I would like to explore that more.
So again, following up on this idea that a kind of a thread through your life and work, right, is our practices of freedom.
Like, Sor Juana, right? Like, many other people just, okay, this is just how we do things, but Sor Juana didn't,
I like that. Thank you. That's a good place to end, I think, on this reflection of Sor Juana's on this, that she wouldn't take it any longer. She wouldn't have it that way.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
Play with it as much as she could.
yeah. There's always material limits to our practices of freedom, but no. Importantly, your work helps us to conceive of different, this imaginative practice of trying to figure out, like, how do we open up space for different ways of thinking, and I think that's very clear that that's what the philosophies of the Americas tries to do. So, thank you for your work. Thank you for being here and sharing with us, and much success on the reader. I hope a lot of people can
This
work
is
on it.
a good point for me to thank you, Jose, because you've been a great role model for me, a great inspiration.
Oh,
No, seriously, because I remember looking at you and thinking, all right, he's doing this with Cesar Chavez, and back then, which was, I'm not going to put years now, right? But it's been some time. You were at the forefront of Latin American philosophy, legitimizing brown people doing philosophy, not just activism. And so I was a graduate student when you were doing that work, and I was thinking, yeah, if he can do it, I can do it too. So you have been an inspiration and a role model. So thank you.
well, thank you. I mean, I told you, before we started recording today, that your collection that you put together, I've been waiting all my life for. When I did start this work way back, even in college, I was trying to find sources for these kinds of discussions, and they didn't exist. And they didn't exist through graduate school. And so I think that you've done a real big service by doing this kind of work. So thank you for putting this all together. And let's hope that future generations can use this well to sort of think about the ways in which they themselves can even expand the discussion further.
Exactly. Take it further.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Dr. Diaz. I appreciate your time with us, and I hope that we can talk more at some point about your work with folks on in the system. That would be a fun conversation. But thank you once again.
Thank you.
And thank you for sharing your time with us today. If you have thoughts about philosophies of the Americas, practices of freedom, uh, inter-American philosophy, we'd love to hear them. Go ahead and leave us a comment down below. Or you can reach us at in all the different social medias, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, at Anarres Project. We look forward to talking with you, and hopefully we can continue some of this discussion together. So thank you once again, Dr. Diaz, and we'll see you soon.